approximately the year 1923. The film starts at McAdam Station.
Our two gentlemen seen walking down the boardwalk by the tracks. We don't know who they were. They may have been friends of the Colonel's. The train in the distance is the dining car and sleepers of the CPR, probably the Montreal train. We're now on our way down the tracks, headed for the well-known summer resort of St. Andrews. We've just passed an antique-looking farmhouse, and now we see one of the railroad employees changing the switch. Next we have Watt Junction and its small station at the side of the tracks. Watt Junction was the small railroad station, and it was a junction of a railroad line coming in from St. Stephen and the one coming up from St. Andrews. And we're now on our way down the tracks towards St. Andrews, and we have had a glimpse of Second Chamcook Lake and the beautiful scenery along the tracks and the telephone poles at the edge of the right-of-way. And here we are at First Lake, which is the large Chamcook Lake. And there's a small promontory which we all used to call a bluff, and all the children used to fish off of this in the early days. We're getting around the bend now on First Lake, and we're coming down along and having a good view of Chamcook Lake. We are now on the straight-of-way, and this leads down past Spruce Hill, which was a club owned by the club owned by a group of St. Andrews businessmen who had many happy times there. You will note at the left of the film there is a sluice, and this was used to get the ice out of the lake. The ice was cut in cubes, and it was harvested in the winter time. It was stored in a building down by the CPR station in St. Andrews, and it was used by the Algonquin Hotel during the summer season. We're still traveling down along the main line towards St. Andrews. On the right of the film, we have just passed a very antique brick church known as St. John's Chapel of Ease. It's an early Church of England edifice, and beside it there is the cemetery, which has many of our early settlers. We're now passing by one of the Mowat homes, coming down towards St. Andrews still. We see outbuildings and a double spur, which is the siding which goes down to St. Andrews North, where in 1914 some of the businessmen concerned with the CPR had a large sardine cannery. On the right there's a small station which was the Chamcook station, and now we are seeing some of the buildings of the plant I was talking about, because they had residences for their staff, and they brought out a group of young women from Norway to pack their fish, and sometimes this area is called Little Norway. Down on the right-hand corner of the film we see the building which was used as the Chamcook Post Office. All the buildings which you have seen in Little Norway, or St. Andrews North as the railroad station was called at that point, have now disappeared with the exception of one building, and you cannot see in this film the big factory made of concrete which still exists. It is now used by the Quaker Oat Company. I might mention that these buildings were covered with stucco to make them look like adobe buildings. Why, I can't tell you. We are now approaching another building that was built at this time, and it has been used by the town as their pumping station for many years. The pumping station is now disappearing on the left-hand side of the tracks. And we continue our journey to St. Andrews. The foliage is beautiful. It must have been in the height of the summer season. Arrival in St. Andrews is not shown, but Colonel Heasley rented this house known as the Stevenson Cottage on William Street in the summertime, and this is the next thing you will see. A white house with beautiful shutters and well kept. This is one of our older houses in the town. Note the tall trees that surround it, and now he's giving us a glimpse of the Algonquin Hotel in the distance. See the Algonquin residence for the men that worked at the hotel, and in the left foreground, the home of Arthur Mason, who was his brother-in-law, Colonel Heasley's brother-in-law. At the time, Mr. Mason was engineer-in-chief at the Algonquin Hotel, and he left St. Andrews in 1929 to become chief engineer upon the opening of the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. And when he retired, he was superintendent of mechanical engineering for the CPR Hotel Department. I also wish you to note the tall smokestack toward the left-hand side of the film. This is no longer in existence, having been taken down some time ago. Apparently, the Colonel walked up Harriet Street taking pictures of various friends of his, and we now see what was known as Meadowbrook Lodge, the home of F.W. Thompson, who was the head of the Ogilvy Flour Mills and was a summer resident of St. Andrews for many years. Apparently, the Colonel turned around, and upon walking back down the street, he took the picture of the McAdam cottage, which you see on the left. We remember McAdam because he had a beautiful yacht with a full staff in the harbor every summer and seemed to enjoy St. Andrews as much as the rest of our early summer colony. The Colonel, during his walk, proceeded down Reed Avenue because he shows us a view of the sidewalk which goes out along with the telephone poles on the right and the summer foliage on his left. We then come in view of the caddy shop and the original Algonquin Golf Clubhouse, which was burned 2 years ago in 1978. Oh my goodness, there goes an old-fashioned car. It has a chauffeur and a passenger in the front and two passengers in the back with antique-looking clothes. And then we come along and we get a different view of the clubhouse, and across the street in the distance there's an old barn with the door open at the Walter Thomas Dairy Farm. Now we see Mrs. Heasley having a game of golf. She is putting on one of the greens of the 9-hole course. Her outfit is a white hat, a beautiful white dress, imagine it, white stockings and white shoes. She's all dressed for the summer weather. He's on the distant green, which is the 4th green on the 9-hole course, are Mrs. Heasley and Mrs. Walter Sadler. Heasley is now seen on the 5th tee, and the film goes on to show the general area of the 5th and 6th. And then Mrs. Heasley is shown coming up the 7th to approach the green. Putts on the 7th, and then the Colonel takes a picture of the 8th. Here we are again at the Stevenson house, and this time he's taking a picture up the street, showing picket fence which encloses a very nice vegetable garden, and later shows the scene of William Street clear up to the head where it joins Prince of Wales. Then we see Mrs. Sadler, who is Mrs. Heasley's sister, taking a walk in the garden along the fence that borders on the King Greenlaw home. She apparently is waiting for her sister. She stands on the sidewalk. Now the Colonel has swung his camera around and has taken a picture of a story-and-a-half house without buildings. This we can't identify at present. Sadler stands by the front steps, and there is the black cat, as she is joined by her sister, Mrs. Heasley. They are walking down along the sidewalk. And then next we see Covenhoven, the summer home of Sir William Van Horn. Two people in the distance, a large gentleman whom we cannot identify, and Mrs. Heasley. And then we go on to the front veranda of the Van Horn home. We see a gentleman unidentified at the left, Mrs. Heasley. In the right background, Miss Adeline Van Horn, and the gentleman that walked across the lawn. Now we see Lady Van Horn rocking on the veranda in the distance with her quaint 1920s hat. This is the main driveway of the estate, showing the porte cochere of the main entrance to the home. We are now taking a look around the garden at the beautiful foliage, and the Colonel apparently has walked into the distance to get a better view of the whole home. Lawns are beautiful and green, and in the left distance we see the water mill, which supplies the water for the Van Horn home. After seeing the windmill, we see some of the foliage, and here is another tableau. A gentleman on the right places a chair, and Lady Van Horn herself is seated in this. At the left foreground, we see Mrs. Heasley, and behind her, Lady Van Horn's nurse. And also just to her right, Miss Adeline Van Horn, and the still unidentified gentleman and Mrs. Sadler. Now we have a scene of the Bar Road where you drive over the bottom of the ocean to get to the Van Horn estate on Minister's Island, and at one spot in the distance you can see the Canadian Sardine Company, which was built around 1912 at Shamrock by gentlemen who were interested also in the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now we have a view of the remarkable car which was built particularly for Miss Adeline Van Horn. It was a square boxy type looking one. Now this is the highway going towards St. Stephen, and we see Greenlaws Mountain in the center of the picture, and the old telephone poles and lots of rocks, and there's the St. Croix River at the spot where it shows the cross of the two branches from which Champlain gave it its name. Around the area of the old Warwick Bridge, and yes, there's the old steel bridge over the Warwick River. And then we journey up along through St. Stephen to Milltown, and the Canadian cotton mill factory, which employed a great many people in the 20s in the town of Milltown. The office building of the mill, and there is the very large building the mill was housed, and the waterway which provided the power to run the mill. It was a water mill. It shows a shot of the town of Milltown across the river. And now we are going down the street, and we came to an antique-looking car to have a round circle in the front, which would indicate it was an early Studebaker. These old touring cars had canvas tops which you could fold down and have an open-air touring car. And now we are proceeding down the St. Andrew, St. Stephen Highway and getting a view of the St. Croix River as we come along. Various hills in the distance. Now we have traversed quite a distance, and apparently we're on our way towards St. John, because now we are seeing St. George Pulp Mill, and this is a picture apparently taken from the upper bridge. Shows a corner of the mill, and there is the old St. George Bridge, what they call the upper bridge, going into the town of St. Stephen, St. George, excuse me. There is the waterway which produces the power for the St. George Pulp and Paper Mill. And bobbing about like anything, and this is the roadway leading into New River Beach. And yes, there's the full sweep of the beach showing one of the headlands, and the white sand and the gentle waves coming in. And here is another roadway going along, and in the distance we see Mrs. Sadler and Mrs. Heasley are walking down this fine and lovely day, and Mrs. Heasley has her hat off. They are going down to Utopia and having a lovely time as they go. Quick trip. We have now arrived in St. John, and we see a young man standing in a doorway, and there are 5 lines of printing on the window, but we cannot decipher it. Over this doorway we see the number 81, and then we go along and it shows a view of the street. It could be Union, and we may be most incorrect in that. There are the tall brick buildings on both sides. On Prince William Street, somewhere in the region of McMillan's the Stationers, and we're looking across Market Square and up Chipman Hill, and on our right we see the foot of King Street and the location of the present Royal Trust building. This view shows us a bit more of Market Square with the large brick buildings, one of them being the Canada Permanent Building, another one housing a leather goods shop, and on the left there is the entrance to Mill & Dock Street. Now we're going up King Street, and there's all its old-fashioned lovely brick buildings and the trolley car coming down the hill. The telephone poles look rather different than they do at the present time. We are now in front of some building there with 2 ladies and a gentleman on each end of the picture. We've now identified the 2 ladies. The one on the left is Mrs. Sadler, and the one on the right is Mrs. Heasley. Now in the Reversing Falls area, and we see on our left the Port Royal Pulp and Paper Company. A bit of the Reversing Falls and a sort of panorama of the area around here. And now we are back to another view of the Port Royal Pulp and Paper Company, which is now owned by the Irving interests. Some rather rough streets and the streetcar tracks and the streetcar on it going along on our right-hand side. And then we see a gorge in the rocks with the water in the distance. It looks like the same area around the Falls Bridge. Our next stop is New River Beach. We see the 3 sisters and a little boy, none other than our own Charles Mason, having a lovely time on the beach. Mrs. Mason is sitting watching Mrs. Heasley and Mrs. Sadler having a lovely time running around and in the surf and out again. Is to run in far enough so that you don't get your skirts wet, or the little fellow doesn't get his short pants wet. But they certainly seem to be having a great time. Mrs. Heasley, Mrs. Sadler, and Mrs. Mason are all sisters. They were formerly Morris, M-O-R-R-I-S girls. Time seems now over, and we see a picnic spread out on a log table at the well above the tide line, and one of the aunts is having fun piling sand on young Charles's legs. The tableau is Mrs. Mason and Charles and Aunt Allison, otherwise Mrs. Heasley. To St. John is apparently over, and the fun at New River Beach. And we now see Mrs. Heasley, who must have been an ardent golfer, having another game on the St. Andrews links.
See scenes next at the home of Mr. Charles Hosmer, who was the head of the Ogilvy Flour Mills and the director of the CPR and Bank of Montreal. This house was right next door to Fort Tipperary, the residence of Lord Shaughnessy, the white building which appears next on the film. See a shot of the Algonquin in the distance, and a distant view of the lighthouse at the head of the CPR wharf. Next we see, one after the other, two open touring cars coming along a dirt road. This time these cars are not identifiable. It's followed by a beautiful view of the waterfront of the town of St. Andrews in the distance, looking from the 9th fairway of the 18-hole golf course at St. Andrews. We have then a glimpse of the Joe's Point Road, which is along the right-hand side of the 9th hole of the course. A distant view of the Algonquin, absolutely impossible from at this time due to the current foliage and the built-up areas between the golf course and the hotel. The small pond, surrounded by beautiful foliage, and the lovely driveways are belonging to the estate of the then Sir Thomas Tate. At the time of this movie, the beautiful house which he ultimately built had not been started because he and Lady Tate couldn't finalize the plans. However, they decided to go ahead with the complete landscaping of the property and built the house at a later date. The house is presently the residence for the students who attend the Huntsman Marine Laboratory courses at St. Andrews. The lady, together with the gentleman in the +4 wandering around the gardens, were Colonel and Mrs. Heasley. The lawn of the Tate property and the pond meld into the left-hand side of the 13th hole of the 18-hole golf course at St. Andrews. We then see more shots of the clubhouse, where you see a number of ladies finishing the 18th hole of the course and being watched by a number on the veranda. We next see the huge sign which graced the entrance to the driveway of Sir William Van Horn's estate on the island. The following scenes were in the rear of Mr. Hosner's home in the gardens there. And we see Mrs. Mason in the black hat wandering around the gardens, and then we see Mrs. Heasley coming out of the house, and shortly after that Mr. Hosmer's nurse, he had by this time suffered a stroke and was under nursing care, and coming out of the house. The next scene shows a car in front of Mr. Hosmer's house, and Mrs. Mason in the black hat coming down the front steps. We then see several views of the Algonquin Hotel and the light-colored building, which is the casino. The scene changes then to the biological station. The first building, the shingle building with the dark roof, is one of the biological buildings, and we see 2 or 3 other shots of the various buildings at the biological station. Oh, and of course the biological wharf. Then a long distant shot showing the shore near the biological station. An unidentified yacht is then seen in the harbor, and then we look towards the town from the end of the market wharf. Directly at the end of the wharf, slightly to the left, we see a frame building which is long since disappeared. Behind that, just to its right, you see the edge of the Bank of Nova Scotia. The present wharf goes to the left of that first mentioned building, which has now been replaced by the present brick post office. The bank at the rear and is unchanged, and the building next to it on the right, the old town hall, has been torn down and a modern one is now in its place. From the market wharf looking eastward, we see the 2 CPR wharves. In the next scene, we see 2 smaller wharves, the first of which was the J.A. Doon Fish Market Wharf, and the second one housed the building which at that time was a clam factory. Both these wharves and the buildings have long since disappeared, and the only evidence of their existence is a few stumps of the pilings that can be seen at low water. The scene then changes back to Mr. Hosmer's front of his house, the driveway, and you see the car and a number of people assisting Mr. Hosmer to get into the car, and then in the final portion of that you see a close-up of Mr. Hosmer seated in the rear of the car. The final scene on the film shows the car going out through an iron gate. Each person that came along, of course, suggested another person who might know a little better or a little more about the situation than the previous one. The last being Mrs. Charles Ballantyne, who was extremely helpful. She suggested as well that probably the most authentic information could come from Mrs. Murray Vaughan, who will be here again for the summer. People at Van Horn's in particular, we have identified Mrs. Heasley, Mrs. Sadler, Mrs. Addie Van Horn, Lady Van Horn, and we're fairly sure of Mr. McTeer, the large gentleman in the +4s who appears at the right of the scenes and also in the first scene at Van Horn's. However, we have no positive identification or any identification for the gentleman on the left of the group at Van Horn's, or the one other large woman who was on the veranda in the same group.